Hey everybody, my name is Aiden. I tried to do this Tech Sunday to talk about collaboration and generally how you should go about working with other people. I think that our school, though it has many strengths, doesn't necessarily teach the animation side of our program, at least, how to work with other people. And in a medium where that's such an important aspect of like making work, I really wanted to at least put together what I've learned through my many experiences, uh, and hopefully it's helpful to somebody. The reason that I'm talking about this is because I've tried to put myself in situations where I was collaborating with people in as many positions as possible. You can kind of see it on the slide in fall semester junior year. I was doing like a little bit of work alongside other people. It was kind of disorganized, but it was a good first start. As spring semester rolled around, I worked with a crew of four. Uh, One person was like in France, I think, but was able to work with him because he's a friend. Uh, in general, I've tried to work like for people in a worker role and with people in a directing role. And I'm kind of hoping that, given the general success of the recent projects that I've done, both projects ended up being finished on time with everybody's contributions as a part of them. Uh, Hopefully, my experiences make the things I'm about to say helpful. Know that like the way that I work is far from perfect. I just figured that this would be maybe like a helpful starting ground for people if they wanted to start like working with others. I think it's an important skill. You don't have to figure it out at all. There are plenty of jobs in animation where you could do what you want exclusively, but I think that it's good to learn how to interact with people. That brings me to who you should work with. You don't necessarily need to work with everybody, and you probably shouldn't, depending on your personality and how it meshes with another person. Uh, Sometimes you might want to work with a person based on similar styles, similar mindsets for creating work. Other times you might want to work with people based on straight up the work that they do. And both approaches, I think, are absolutely wonderful, things that you should consider. In terms of who you actually like put that time in to like work with them, I really do think it should be people that you can rely on, people that you can trust with your ideas, people who can generally mesh well with what you've been doing, and people that can respond to you. At least in my experience, it's been easiest to work with sophomores in RISD. They do less big projects, and in all honesty, sometimes work like this on other people's films is a generally better way to gain experience than the stuff that you would be doing in class. You could consider working with freshmen. That kind of depends on like the individual freshman's skill set though. The freshmen are always busy with EFS, so take that into consideration when you're trying to figure out how much work people are doing. Most of the time in RISD, your crew will be friends, whether it be people that you just sort of like approach and ask, hey, do you want to work on this? And other times it could be that you're just a group and you just make a bunch of stuff together. Both are pretty common. Sometimes there are specific clubs that you can submit work to and generally like get crews that way. Ground motion picture is something that is around here, and RISD students have contributed to ground motion picture. If that's something that you want to try and do, have at it. There are also calls for submissions. Like if you've seen any CalArts students' Instagram, they'll have a call for submission on voice acting or composers or something of the sort, generally around the time frame where they're making their film. These are pretty good ways to get people to be involved. You can also do those submissions for specific moments and scenes in your film. really depends on what you're going for. And if you're looking specifically for actors in a professional sense, at least for live action, people use Backstaged here. I don't know if it's always the best situation, but it's what I know people to use, and it seems like it works for them. These are kind of like the three most important things that I think people should know about collaboration, the three most important skills that I think hold a project together. If you've ever seen one of those weird corporate posters where they have like a little triangle of stuff, I feel like this is my triangle. If one part isn't working, then the other parts won't either. To start off, communication. Are you able to clearly convey what you're trying to do and what you want from people when you're assigning a task? Are you able to keep in contact with people as they work on the task? Have you set up a situation where people can give you this information? Organization is the next important thing. If you can't really keep track of the work that you've been doing, then it's hard to figure out your progress. It's harder to communicate to others what work needs to be done. You should generally try and figure out some consistency in terms of like software and I guess the platforms you're intending the film to be for. How should you organize your files? How should you accumulate everything that everybody is doing on this? And when you need to meet, how should you? Overall, just how can you set up the work that you're doing so that everything else can run smoothly after that? And then the last thing is, of course, adaptability. Like when there is a problem that arises, what do you do? In one of the projects that I was working on, one of my crewmates' computers was broken. It stayed that way over the course of weeks, mainly because every time they took it to a repair shop to try and get it fixed, there would still be some unknown weird error that kept it in a broken state. So what do you do in that situation? If you're not able to adapt to whatever arises, your organization might be thrown awry and the amount of communication that you can do might be hindered to a certain extent. If you're not able to organize your project well, again, harder to communicate. And then because it's harder to communicate, it's going to be harder to adapt to whatever is already going wrong with the disorganized structure that you have. And if you're not able to communicate, then regardless of how well you organize and how well you adapt, nobody will understand what you're trying to tell them. If you're able to figure out all three of those things, I think that it's at least a start to knowing how to work with others. There's a lot more like tiny little niche things to figure out, but I consider all of these like essentials. Even while all that's happening, keep in mind that life is complicated and weird and messy at the best of times. Like, know that going in when you're working with people. Sometimes a computer breaks. Other times there's some weird weather thing. Maybe like the Wi-Fi goes down. Maybe there's a situation where you can't entirely trust the technology that you're trying to use. Try and build a situation where you know that things are not going to go right 100% of the time, and make sure that you're prepared for that. I'm going to mention it now for the sake of emphasis, but money is a really, really important thing to think about and focus on when you're doing a collaboration if you're using it, because it complicates things. Everything becomes far harder and far more weird when money is involved. So if it is, make sure that you go into the project knowing that that is the case. So I said the communication was important. How should you do the communication? In general, I think that like people should try and be as completely transparent with their project as they possibly can be. This hopefully helps the people that you're working with just so that they can see as much as you can possibly show them. If they don't understand something, great. Because you've shown them a bunch of stuff, they can maybe point to something that isn't there and give you questions that can help flesh out their understanding of what you're trying to do, and it can help you have a greater understanding of your own project. In general, I feel like when there is a miscommunication in a project, since you are the person leading, it's your responsibility to clear any of that up and make sure that one, the person that is working with you isn't like wasting their time trying to do all this work. And two, if they have the clearest idea of what to do, they would hopefully have the fewest amount of revisions possible. Overall, again, everybody is busy. It's already hard to squeeze in one round of work. So making sure that there's as little back and forth adjustments as possible is like somewhat important. Overall, it also helps with like how you feel about the work that you're doing. If you are trying your best to communicate with the people that are working with you, then like until somebody asks a question, there's only so much that you can kind of speculate about. Did I fuck this up? Did something go wrong? Like it limits the amount that you like get in your head about your own project to a certain extent. You should also try and delegate tasks when that's a realistic thing. If you've got enough people working with you, trying to play into the strengths of those around you is going to help everybody out. It will make it so that you can have as high a quality output as you can manage with those that you're working with. So how should you organize after that? In general, try and figure out like what programs everything should be held on, what everybody's schedules are, so that like when you need to communicate with people, you know when you will be able to do so. Try and build situations where people can communicate with you as much as possible, especially for student projects where like deadlines are pretty strange. Make it so that trying to get information from one end to the other is as simple as possible. Our Google Drives are a really good place to generally store files. So if you're working with other people, make a folder, share it with them, and you should be able to share everything that way. Sometimes there are like upload errors or weird errors about like specific files. In those cases, you just communicate those problems and they can be fixed. I make a specific note here. If you're going to use the RISD Cintiq Lab, don't rely on the Wi-Fi for any uploads to Google Drive. The Wi-Fi is constantly down in that building, or at least like in my experience, it has been. I've generally gone in with like a USB drive, plugged that into the computer, and then uploaded things onto Google Drive later at home. That seems like it's a system that works fairly well. We have those LaCie drives. They're also a pretty good place of storage. They have, I think, 2 terabytes worth of data. And depending on the size of your project, that should be at least helpful, if not something that fully stores what you've got. Overall, try and make sure that everybody knows how to communicate, when to communicate, what to generally use for like uploading files, sending files. How do people like work best? How do they communicate best? Try and figure out as much of that as possible, and then structure based on what would work for the crowd you've got. In terms of adaptation, a lot of the like practical information that I thought to include doesn't really focus on like any specific event, just because life is random and there will always be some random thing. It's less about like any individual thing that happens and more the idea of if something could go wrong, what's the best possible like plan B, second, third, fourth outcome. On top of the other adaptability stuff, I also listed like generally how to deal with crit, because that is something that your project adapts to. Overall, I feel like the best approach to a crit is trying to figure out how much somebody else understands of what you've conveyed to them. Sometimes people can be like 100% right on the dot about something that you've done. And that's important to take note of. Sometimes people are like way, way off about what they're saying, and there's just stuff you straight up shouldn't listen to. Other times, somebody might be unhappy or unsatisfied with a part of your project, but that might not necessarily be because they don't like that part. It could also be because whatever you've got fails to convey the core of what you were trying to do. And then other times, people's might not be helpful because their brain works better in certain situations. Like there are a couple of people, a couple of professors that are really good at giving feedback when something is moving. Once something is in motion, they are locked in, they are able to reliably give you some sort of feedback. Figuring that out and knowing when and how to listen is the important part here. Generally, best practices for working with other students. Ask for participation early. I believe that when I was working on stuff for the spring semester, I asked people if they would like to participate in winter session. When I was working on my thesis film, I asked the first collaborator, like my co-director, if they wanted to do this like in the previous year, and then we worked on it over the summer. I believe I asked if my crew would want to participate in the project as well at a similar time, and they agreed. Again, circumstances can change, but generally, if you give people a lot of time to figure out what you want to do, it makes it so that they understand what you're doing better. They can provide more helpful or insightful feedback, and hopefully we'll be able to do work that requires as few revisions as possible, which again is the best situation for you because you don't have to do any more back and forth. And it's best for them as well because they are busy, they have other things to do. A bunch of stuff can change in like the interim, but you know, that's a good place to start, I think. Try to give people a solid amount of time for whatever you ask them to do. Everybody has a life, and your project, because it's not theirs, is going to be like a second or third priority as a regular result of how life goes. That's not something you should try and fight. That's something you should just work with. Try and provide all the people that you're working with like some description of what you want them to do, so like any keyframes, roughs, designs that they need to do it, and generally like the specifications that they should be working at. If you're a crewmate, try and provide updates whenever you can. If you're a director, try and ask for updates whenever you can. If somebody is confused, sometimes they won't be able to like verbalize that until you ask them. It's all situational, but those are some things. These are more like mistakes from the projects that I've been working on. In my thesis film, I thought it would be a good idea to give rolling deadlines for a lot of different situations. I figured, oh, if I'm assigning this work and I'm trying to give people as much time as possible to complete it, then it would be good to be pretty lax. I would say like vaguely around here is when you should have that done. I think that that was a mistake. Even if you are guessing and your guess isn't super accurate, you can like negotiate around the guess of a solid deadline more so than you can with, you know, vaguely something should be done around here. That's bad. In general, I've learned that being vague is the least helpful thing possible. And in this situation, at least, I think that it caused a little bit more stress than it probably should have for a lot of people, because I think that people forgot uh, about it for a little bit, because I gave, I think, like months or so for some of this work. And again, people are busy, they have lives. So they were living their life and uh, might have forgotten about the thing that I had asked them about a, like a month ago or something. And then it ended up being a situation where a lot of people uh, gave me something at like the last possible minute. Some of that could be absolutely fine, but it's a situation that I created that could have caused stress for other people. And since I'm giving this presentation, I figure to like make a note about it as a potential problem, try and give a more solid deadline, and then make it very clear that if it's not possible, and if you're not prepared with the adequate amount of knowledge to give this solid deadline and have it be definite, give people a bit of wiggle room, tell them, okay, listen, like this is entirely negotiable. If it's not possible with what I'm saying, let me know what is for you and we can work that out. It gives a person that is doing work for you a solid idea of when they should have things done, and it makes it so that you understand what another person is capable of, their work rate, their general like ability to do the task. If you ask late for something, then trying to accommodate wherever possible. Like be very transparent about where things are with your project, so that you can hopefully get some good results. Try and communicate as much as you can with other people. Try and make things as clear as possible. When they're not clear, make them so. And in situations where you have to give a deadline, try and be specific and then make it clear that like there is wiggle room and we can figure this out as time goes on. Like I guess that's like the adaptability part of it. If your initial plan wasn't perfect, make sure that everybody knows, hey guys, this plan was not perfect. We can adjust this. I tried to come up with this bunch of stuff after the Brown, RISD, Berkeley mixer that we had. We had a meeting with composers from other schools and wanted to generally get to know people. That's all cool, but how should we work with composers? In the same way that I'm talking about how should we work with other students, how should we work with these people that are making music, because it's such an entirely different field that a lot of people aren't super familiar with. At least in terms of like RISD projects, most of the time the person making your music is a friend that you ask and they say yes, and then they make music for you. And you give feedback depending on what you think is working well or not. And it's fairly informal. If you're going to work with a composer from like outside of RISD that isn't familiar with these processes, it might be different for them depending on, I don't know, their schedules, the way that they're used to working. In general, it seems like a lot of the music folk have different terminology and words that they use to talk about what they're going for than we would have. So trying to figure out where to meet them halfway is going to be pretty important. As far as the questions that I ask people, the information that I got is on this slide. Like try and get into contact as early as possible for people so that even if you have like nothing to show, they can generally get the vibe of what you're going for and at least start to look at their schedule and say, okay, I should plan to do some work on this guy's project here. It at least gives a starting point that, again, you'll be able to refine as more work is done. I think at this point they were saying that they would just do kind of like smaller themes or ideas for stuff, nothing really concrete, more like gauging the vibe of the project. In terms of like when they'd be able to do more substantial work for you, for live action, I believe they said it was when there's a rough edit. And for animation, they were saying that like they've been working with animatics and that's been fine. I think that the reasoning for that is that like an actual shoot can differ widely in terms of the timing from say like an animatic of what people thought was going to happen. It's just you're working with real people And a lot of the time working on a set can be like somebody could realize based on the circumstances of the day or the weather that a certain thing would look better or worse, and then things change. I believe that that's why they're asking for like rough edits, just so that they know that some amount of footage has been solidified and that like when they work, it's not going to be a completely different film that they then completely need to rethink later. I don't think animation has that problem as much because as soon as we get the animatic, that's kind of what we've got and we'll continue with. Try to have references for the kind of music that you're going for, even if it's just a specific part of a song, being able to point to, say, I don't know, like the trumpets in a jazz song and be like, oh, hey, I like these trumpets. If you could do something like this for a part of it, that would be great. That would probably be helpful information if like you'd be looking for some sort of like string-ish instrument uh, in a certain part, being able to have a reference to pull from is generally going to make it so that you're probably happier with whatever they're able to do, and they're able to do less work to get something that both of you are happy with. I think I've seen this from both the composers that I asked as well as professionals that have worked on like video games, but using emotional language to convey what you're looking for with different parts of a score is super important. Overall, trying to avoid like terms that are more related to like technical music unless you really, really know them, because these people may have a completely different understanding of those words since they may have been taught them a completely different way. A composer can and is used to reworking something so that it can fit whatever you've got. Just keep in mind that there's only so much that a person can do. Again, be mindful of people being people and try not to overload them with anything ridiculous. One person said that it takes about a week to write 2 minutes of music. I don't know if like this specifically refers to just the composing and not necessarily performance. So keep that in mind. Like this is still kind of grain of salt-y. The last thing, and I think that this is generally a theme with all this stuff, avoid being vague. If you're going to give people terms that are not super helpful for them, people will not understand you. And it will be harder all around because then you need to try and like search for more and more things to convey this information. And they will be more confused and more unable to work for a longer period of time. In terms of compensation, that can vary widely depending on the different composer that you talk to. Some composers, like being students themselves, will be like, this is student work. I'd be fine with doing this for free. Other people might want to start charging money. I think it kind of depends on where everybody is at. There are some ways that you can generally try and accommodate for like a lower budget on your end. One of the things that a composer specifically mentioned was letting composers retain rights to their music can offset having lower pay, because then after your film is done, they are still able to do with that music whatever they wish. That's super important. Making sure to provide credit is something that is important to composers. And if your film does well in like film festivals, if there are monetary awards, that might be something where you might want to renegotiate the terms of these things with the composers. It kind of depends on the situation that you're in. Okay, so what will go wrong in this process? Everybody is busy, so sometimes you're just shit out of luck when it comes to hearing back from people. That's just a fact of life. Some people really struggle to communicate their wants and needs. People are just people. There's only so much that a person is able to share at a given time. That's natural. Make sure that you're able to talk through any larger issues if they exist, though. Like, it could be a situation where it's just somebody having trouble conveying what they're talking about, but it could also be indicative of maybe you've set up a situation where it's actually not as easy as you thought it was to communicate these things openly. Trying to ascertain whether that's the case or not is pretty important. Sometimes people just don't listen to you. This can be despite all the asks, all the bits of feedback that you provide. Some people just do not communicate things and will not listen to you. They will do what they want to do, and that's kind of it. In those situations, there's not much you can do. They've already done the work, they've already committed to doing the work, and you now have it. There's not there's not too much to adjust there. And a lot of times that can be fine. Sometimes you might have to completely scrap something, but other times you can slightly rework stuff and it'll work just fine. Try to pick your battles like wisely in terms of when to address any and all of this. Again, people are people. There's only so much that a person can do at the end of the day. And sometimes something that you think is like a larger concern, if you stepped back and gave yourself a little bit of distance, would actually be really minor and kind of stupid to bring up in the first place. Another thing is like to generally avoid some of this, try and give notes in writing. It's very, very easy for people to forget things. I'm a forgetful person. I like a lot of the time I'll like go back and forth from my room because I've forgotten to bring one thing out of it and I've forgotten to bring it out of my room multiple times. Knowing that people are like this, try and make it so that there's something to refer back to when they want to know what you want from them. Another thing is that sometimes a situation gets tense. That sucks. So, like I've heard bad situations where like a director has yelled at somebody on a film set, or like in general, something happens to create a more harsh environment than you can really deal with. In those situations, try and assess whether you need to adjust for any of that. Sometimes you might be in the wrong and that you should apologize and try and fix the situation. Other times it could be somebody that's being completely unreasonable. Try to figure out those things, but make sure that you give yourself distance from the situation. If your emotions are intense, then you're probably not going to be able to view things with the absolute best mindset possible. And that's generally how you're going to want to make decisions. And overall, collaboration isn't meant to be this thing where everybody is mad or like upset and morale is low. We do this to work together and have fun. So at as many situations as possible, try and mend the situation. If that doesn't work, it doesn't work, and there's only so much you can do there. But trying to be open and honest and communicating with transparency is kind of the most that you can do. And in situations where things are really tense or intense, give yourself a little bit of time to evaluate everything. In terms of organization, there's always going to be something that you didn't account for at the beginning that becomes important later on. That's, again, just how life works. Things are not perfect. As long as you're able to communicate with others, that's something that can be very quickly fixed. But, you know, it's something to keep in mind. Sometimes something just happens and you can't deal with the situation properly. Things just get thrown awry, and there's really nothing you can do about that. Sometimes it can happen in a way that like puts a person in a situation where they're unable to do much for you for a given period of time. That's fine. Try and adapt where you can. Try and figure out a situation where you can still stay on top of things. Sometimes things aren't as bad as you think, and it just feels like that in the moment because something has happened and you're feeling intense about it. Again, like making sure that you give yourself a little bit of distance sometimes can help out with that a lot. And generally try and be objective with yourself and the situation. Sometimes there's only so much that you can do. Sometimes things just don't work out, and that sucks. Just in those situations where everything is completely screwed, I guess try and pivot, but also be kind to yourself. You are a person with emotions that are important, and sometimes you just need a little bit of time to not do anything before you can really assess what to do in the first place. Sometimes whatever you try and do to adapt doesn't work. Sometimes it's not feasible. It might not work within the scope, within budget, within like the abilities of the people that you have at your disposal and your own skills. Sometimes it's just not possible to do what your ambitious mind thinks is a great idea. In those situations, try and compromise on stuff. Try not to stick to something that isn't working for so long that you then have to continue to commit to it. Try and find a way to compromise on it or accommodate generally people's skill sets. A lot of times you can reframe something a little bit or rework something a little bit and end up with a situation that's completely fine. Sometimes that's not the case, and that sucks. But you know, you still have time to do whatever you're doing. It's not like when something just doesn't work, everything is over. We we are like in our 20s. None of the things that we're doing right now are solid or set in stone, and we're allowed to fuck up sometimes. Um, in terms of like crit notes, sometimes you can listen to a little too much of what other people have to say. There are situations where maybe you're so open to what other people are trying to say that you lose a little bit of like the overall vision that you had in the first place. In situations like that where you're trying to do changes, I guess try and think about what you wanted this thing to be in the first place, and whether you think that the changes you're making will be in service to that or detract. And if it does detract, will it detract from the original spirit but end up with something that is stronger or more powerful? Sometimes you've chosen to stick to the wrong parts of your project as well. And that's a situation where like the only thing you can really do is try to be a little bit cautious about like going about what to change and what to keep. Try and be as open as possible, but again, you're not perfect. That like it can't be expected of you to make the absolute best decision all the time. If you're working with people from outside of RISD, try and be extra sure that you can communicate with other people. Like make sure that you and them have like a firm understanding of how you want to talk about stuff, what's best for them, what you need, and what they can do to make that happen. Try and understand their schedule so that you can reliably reach them at a time where like you're not accidentally throwing off their entire day. There was a time where I was trying to communicate with somebody and I ended up calling this fella at like dinner, interrupted dinner with his family. That sucked. I didn't mean to do that, but it did happen. Like set things up so that you have as few of those situations as possible, because I think everybody wants to live their day, and make sure that you give more time than is probably necessary. We're at RISD, we're at an art school. This is the only thing that we're doing. But for people that are elsewhere where you don't necessarily know all of their responsibilities, generally try and be generous with time. This is a slide that I was foreshadowing a little bit when I mentioned money earlier. Money and legality make everything way, way more important. From a worker's perspective, if you're under a contract that really, really limits and restricts you, that might make things a lot more stressful. From a like director's perspective, if you set all these things in stone, you might be expecting something that may be like unreasonable based on the overall situation you've constructed. Again, that like people aren't perfect, but if you're going to deal with contracts and legally binding documents, make sure that one, you reach out to people super duper early so that everybody like, and I'm talking about reach out to people with the general idea of the contract there so that people can negotiate, like have time to figure out if this is the work that they want to do, if this is the amount that they want to be compensated for. Um, like give yourself time to generally have those conversations, and give the other person time to consider what you're asking of them. Try and properly research a lot of things about contracts if you're expected to sign or if you're making a contract. Like if you don't know what you're doing, then you could inadvertently put somebody in a really bad spot. Uh, and if you don't know what you're doing when you're signing a contract, you could be throwing yourself into a really bad situation without the proper knowledge to, I don't know, adapt to it. Make sure that like if there is pay, any terms surrounding it are completely understood by every single person involved within it. And try and ensure that when you're putting together this contract, if you're the person making it, and if you're the worker advocating for yourself before you sign it, try and make sure that both of you have some amount of pull within the contract. Generally, trying to avoid situations where you're kind of screwed. If you can't pay somebody the amount that the work really should be, just be honest with it. You know, like we are all students, everybody has a budget. Just be aware of the fact that that's the case. Be transparent about that being the situation that you're in. Ultimately, the money and legality stuff is something that you should be prepared to have figured out. Give yourself and others time, and make sure that everybody is as happy as they possibly can be before anybody is signing anything. Honestly, this is kind of the end of things. My last little parting bunch of stuff is be all right with pestering people a little bit, because sometimes people won't get back to you in the time frame that you need. Be polite about it, but like, you know, if you need information, try and get it. Try and give yourself breaks when you can. If you're tired, then you're not going to make the work that you really, really want to make. And it helps you do all of the different, like, communicate, organize, adapt parts of the process way, way better. And make sure that you have people that you can talk to so that you stay sane. Handling a bunch of work all at once is a difficult task, and that's something that we should be aware of. We shouldn't be shy about it. We shouldn't pretend like, oh, I just kind of have to shoulder this burden. You don't. Other people would love to talk to you and with you about the situations that you're going through. And it's important to recognize that. And then also just hang out with people. Make sure that you have fun, have a life, do all the things that you want to do with your time. We're students. We are here to learn. We're here to grow. And that's not necessarily just with our studies, that's growing as people. Give yourselves time to do that. You only are able to be in this situation once, and try and make the best of it when you can. Collaborating doesn't mean that work just disappears. It's not like you tell somebody to do something and then all of a sudden the work is gone, and then eventually you will have the finished product somewhere falling down from the heavens. No, somebody did that. Somebody is doing all of the work that you're asking for them. And so when you're going through these processes, when you're trying to like work with other people, make sure that that's something that you are respecting. If you don't want to do any of the things that I've been saying at all, completely fine. But be aware that the work that you're asking of people doesn't just go away when you ask another person to do it. And keep in mind that you should be doing some work yourself to make sure that the people who are working with you have as much information as they possibly can, have all the tools at their disposal to make work that they're proud of and that you're happy with. As a crew member, ask questions. I think like I would go to all of those like conferences or like internship discussion things, and people would always say like it's really important for prospective interns to ask questions. I don't really think that that's to be like, oh, this kid is studious, they are going to survive. No, it's that like there's a lot of people who have kind of been trained societally to think that they understand more than they actually do and to push forward with that in mind. If you don't understand something, make it clear that you don't understand something because people are like very, very open and willing to help you. I think that there's also a situation where like if you are the director and somebody else is the worker, there's like implicitly some level of hierarchy there, and it makes asking questions a little more daunting. Just like try and uh, overcome that whenever you can to ask for what you need and what clarity they can provide. The last couple things, it's okay to make mistakes, and your work is not you. Uh, that's all I've got. Uh, if any of this was helpful and it's information that you would like to keep around, I've got a QR code that will give you a PDF of all of the slides that I've created here. And if you're in the FAV Discord, I'll probably have posted the slides there. Hope this was helpful for everybody. That's me.